spoke of. It's the large terminal area where people would naturally gather before being then leaving across the tarmac to board the plane. As the crowd grew, so did laughter and chatter, and it seemed as though with the increase of noise there was an increase in pensive silence with us. No one appeared to take the slightest notice of God-man seated in the corner of that building. From our occasional glances, it seemed as if they were absorbed in their light-hearted gaiety and noisy comradeship. In the days that followed, we learnt that this large, loud, talking crowd close to us were farewelling the leader of a religious sect. But what was so interesting was that I didn't notice, I don't remember even looking in that direction, but one of the Australian men commented afterwards that quite a number of the people present there were people who had come to that darshan program, that opportunity of meeting Baba, which Baba permitted in 1956 at Mayer House in Sydney. So many people came that we had invited, people that we had spoken to, members of meditation groups and religious groups whom we had invited. Well, many of them were in that crowd, and they'd taken no notice of Baba. No doubt it was an illusion, but it seemed that the area containing beloved Baba and us became more withdrawn and dimmed, separated from the brightly lit areas nearby. He himself sat there, so simple, so still, silent and unpretentious, and yet that very scene and his presence made me more aware of the richness that lay beneath the surface, and nurtured my inner assurance that he always remains. That memory takes me back to the simplicity of his house at Avatar's abode, and the richness of his inner being that I feel when I open the door to his room and enter what I feel to be the equivalent of his heart. Often the question is asked, what has been gained from one's contact with God-man? What has one learnt from the Lord in his advent as Meher Baba? What can one say? The answer seems to lie within the words of Dr. Donkin when he was asked that question. It is not what I've gained, but what I've lost in the form of useless mental baggage. Reliving such times with beloved Baba seems to slow down thoughts of knowing this or knowing that, of having achieved this or having achieved that. One is conscious only of him. The mind is monetarily stilled, except for an awareness of him and of a readiness to obey him, whatever his wish. It is at times such as these that one understands a little more when it is said that the spiritual path is one of clearing and starving the mind of all but thoughts of loving and serving him. By the time the flight was called, the crowd groped around the departure gate had become a solid mass. Interestingly, Some of the people, now apparently oblivious of Baba, were among those who had come to the public day. I had written that, I'd forgotten. On Baba's first visit in 1956. I am told that Nariman shouted something in Hindi, and quickly the crowd parted and a clear passageway appeared. We stood there and watched as Baba walked slowly forward, supported by Mundley on each side. We watched heedless of the crowd, God-man's back receding, and then he was gone. No farewells, no turning, no waving. And that seemed to be so natural with Baba. Just gone.
Yeah.
Just gone.
He's everywhere. So.
Yeah. Yeah. But it was such a vivid time in memory, that scene. But I might mention, which I'm sure has been written up, but I might mention that at one point Baba gestured to Erich, and I was not aware of it, but the next thing I know that Erich had gestured to Francis and I, the three of us were smokers, that we should go off and have a cigarette. So we went round the corner so that it was away from Baba. And we had a smoke and then returned. There was another occasion when Baba suddenly gestured, "Where is Dr. Donkin?" and directed that I should go and tell him that Baba wants him. So I went off and I found him installed at one of the desks, a deserted desk, with quite a pile of postcards that he was obviously sending to people, and he was busy writing in his doctor's scrawl how they could read what his message was. Heaven only knows. All I know is that he was writing extremely fast on each card. And I gave him the message, and his only response was yes, yes, and somehow or other writing even faster in order to finish the pile of cards before returning to Baba. I returned and reported, and I'm not quite sure, but I think Baba told me to go back and repeat the message, which I did, and Dr. Donkin then came. Those little incidents, but the image of Baba sitting on that couch, pensive and withdrawn, and we all just stood silently. As I said, it must have been at least 2 hours, and yet there was no sense of time. For myself, I could have just gone on, just being there. It reminds me again of being with Baba in the car, and again silence, and yet not a silence that is heavy and awkward, and the sense of the need to fill it with something. None of that. His presence, his silent presence, was enough. Just to be with him. Yes. Yes, well, so that And then Baba, and again that farewell was so natural with Baba. Just, there was a call, and Baba immediately got up and started walking. There was no sort of like, well, do something. He just started walking, and immediately the Mandali were each side of him, and as I said, Nariman, I remember hearing some words, but what they were, heaven only knows. And it could have been Hindi or Marathi or it could have been English. But it was just wonderful how it was like a wave of people that just parted. And Baba just went straight through and went. Yeah. So that was it. That's the end.
There was something I don't know if you mentioned it when you were back at Mayor House and before dinner. Remember there was spiritual chit-chat, and didn't Baba ask Francis to pick something out of the Hafiz?
Ah, yes. One of those occasions, one of the little things that happened was Baba asked was there a translation of Hafiz? And yes, we did have one. I've forgotten now which one it is. But Francis opened it and read one of the ghazals, and Baba said no, it was not a good translation, and it was not continued. Again, there must have been there was so many hours. There was movement, there were things being done, but at the same time, there was also that same sense of completeness, despite the fact that there were periods when nothing was said or little was said, and we were just there with him.
But he was comfortable and happy.
But he seemed to be comfortable and happy, definitely. There was such a contrast of Baba then, as he was then during that day, and as he was here at the abode. It was as though he was working.
Yes.
And he was working on the history of the next 700 years for Australia, before he returned, as he said he would then. Okay, Jai Baba. So to continue our wonderful story of Baba in Australia. More than in Australia, it was also in India too. But there were, as it turned out, we didn't know, of course, but after Baba departed in 58, it was actually 4 years, more than 4 years, because we didn't see him again until November of 1962. So in other words, it was almost 4.5 years before we saw him again. What did we do? What happened during that period? It was, as always, a rich period in my life with God-man. There's no question of it. There was no period that wasn't rich in so many ways, because he was so much a part of our life. He just penetrated every aspect of our life, even to the extent at one stage of the group of us, the Baba family, you could say, and it was in a real sense a Barber family in Sydney. It was mostly elderly people, because Robert and Lorna Rouse, the other young ones, were now at Avatar's abode, and so it was almost as though Joan and I and the children were the only young ones, and the rest were elderly, and my children would refer to the women as aunts, or the men as uncles.
Is this the period when they made the Caliana fruitcake?
Yes, I'm just getting to that. Yes. and I was going to say that it was even rich to the extent that at one stage the Barber family, and we all gathered and we all stirred the pot, as it were. Yeah. Don't tell me how. All I know is that we made a big fruit cake for Barber. It had, if I remember rightly, it was made with soya bean flour. Yes. Anyway, all I can say was I can remember all of us being in the small kitchen and stirring the cake, or stirring the pot, as you might say, prior to sending it off and receiving a note from Barber. How it was quite a delightful note, which I've still got. It's in a letter that Money, Barber's sister, Money, wrote, saying how he had a taste of it, and so did the Mundley, and how much he enjoyed it. Perhaps I'll find that note and read it from Money's letter. Yeah, but apart from that, it was a period where the children were older and appreciated reading, more sophisticated reading than simple fairy tales.
You'd be getting Francis's letters too, wouldn't you?
Oh yes, and I would read the life of, for example, I read an account of a translation of the Ramayana, that is the story of Ram and Sita, God-man, the advent of God-man a few thousand years back. I don't know how many. It was a period where Stay With God was finished and was published, and I took over the distribution of it, which kept me very occupied.
What about all those pamphlets? When did you do that?
Well, the pamphlets were in the 60s. No, mostly but at the same time, we still did pamphlet distribution on a more minor scale in those years. I had certain difficulty financially because my 5 years with the army was up, and I took various positions, mostly consulting positions in the employment area of employment of executives with companies. That's another another story. That was also a period 6 months after Barbara left in June 1958. In January of 1959, Francis, called by Barbara, went to India and subsequently stayed with him for 10 years until he returned in 1969. Barbara had said, "When I drop the body, you are to return immediately to Australia." And that's what happened. Well, shortly after the Great Darshan program of 69, and then Francis returned. But during those years, because of Francis being in India and being with Barbara, we started receiving letters from him regarding Barbara's work, activities, things, impressions. Very good letters, very good group letters that he would write for all of us to read.
Again, a nice feeling of Barbara family.
Exactly. All that helped to keep Barbara absolutely active and present in our life.
Keep the home warm.
In the same way, letters from Money, letters from other Mundley came, Adi. Yes, and so again, it was all I can say is, although we didn't see Barbara for 4.5 years, it was rich with Barbara's presence, awareness of him all the time. There was no time. Again, we kept it alive, you could say, not only by the meetings, the constant regular meetings we had of the Barbara family in Sydney, but also not only the making of that cake, but also, for example, creating gardens. We had time then to decorate around Mayer House. We hadn't had time. We'd always been so busy, occupied with building the house, and as it were, establishing ourselves as householders. Now it gave us time to create gardens and improve the pathways, improve the general layout of the land, do whatever we could.
And your parents moved in?
And then my parents then moved in. That again was another period of activity. Yeah. So
The
it.
house below.
Yeah. The garage by then had become a house, and my parents became occupied with not only gardening also around their house, but also painting. They'd taken on painting, and also, as far as I was aware, of reading the books that were published of Barbara, God Speaks, the discourses, etc. Yeah, so that was the period, and then of course it was, yes, so many things happened during that time. One of the interesting things was the way in which the members of the Barbara family became so active and so important in the work that spreading his message involved. We were always active. I mean, Baba had told me had told me, but also he made it very clear that the work that would please him, and also, of course, it automatically involved us in being aware of him, of thoughts of him, of having to.
Did he have mentioned this to you when he was in Australia? I mean, I presume he did in 54.
And 58, yes.
And 56?
56 and 58, each time.
Said it to you each time?
Each time, very emphatically, that was the main order that he gave me. And what a wonderful order, in the sense that automatically it involved me in study and thought, and as it were, becoming aware, gradually aware over the years, that it's all very well to read about it and to say, oh yes, Baba says to love others and think of others, be happy in the happiness of others, suffer in the suffering of others. But it became, over the years, one became, by his grace, aware that this is all very well to read, but what about doing? What about actually living it, the message?
Well, and not only that, but what a curious choice to choose you to spread his message.
Yes. Well, that is so true, because over those years I was very inarticulate. I had great difficulty expressing myself and expressing my ideas of what it meant to love Baba, and how to live his message.
Even your childhood.
Even in my childhood. Well, I mean, now that you've brought it up, perhaps I haven't mentioned it, but I didn't speak until I was 4.5, and I was put back at school because of my difficulty in expressing myself. I can remember not being able to, again as a teenager, and so on. It continued, and was at times very painful in my employment, in my work as a psychologist. 1-to-1, I was all right with one person. Under the circumstances of an interview, I could manage it. But in terms of explaining my thoughts and feelings, I had extreme difficulty. So it seems so strange that Baba would emphasize so strongly that major role that he wanted me to adopt.
And subsequently, you mentioned it in 62.
Oh, in 62, and then in 67, of course, was the culminating.
He really hit you.
Aspect of this story of me spreading a message when Baba said, everywhere there is a flame of love developing for me, but not in Australia. And of course I was the one that was principally responsible for from 54 through to 67, especially when Francis departed at the end of 58. Anyway, to continue those years before the East-West Gathering of 62, another interesting thing that developed in terms of people becoming active in the work, in helping me. I must mention, of course, Reg Paffel, wonderful person, a wonderful help. May Lundquist, another wonderful person, and Diana Snow, again, very active. Those three, and then those three particularly were joined. Mind you, they all helped. There's no question that Emily Firmstone, Marge Donaldson, Marge, I can't. The names evade me for the moment, but they all helped. But there were ones that that stood out particularly, perhaps because of their skills and the circumstances. But another one that joined in '61, early '61, was an applicant to a job, an executive position in I was interviewing this people for an executive position with an advertising agency, and one of the applicants was a Judith Garbutt, and she noticed the photograph of Barbara that I had in the office, and asked about it, and that was the beginning of her conviction, her attachment to Barbara, that led to her meeting Barbara in 1962. And at that time...
She came looking for a job.
Yeah, she came looking for a job and found God. Yeah.
She saw a photo in your office?
She saw a photograph, a big photograph that I had on the wall.
Yeah.
And it was very easy. I mean, you couldn't miss it because they would sit here and it was there.
Right.
Yeah. Not right in front.
But to the side.
But to the side.
Yeah. Nice.
And she, yes, and Barbara, because of her skill as a secretary, she was also, had been it doesn't matter, but she had held an executive position in advertising, but the background was very secretarial in the sense that she knew shorthand and typing extremely well. And Barbara directed that she should help me, and so she did over the years, virtually 40 years, 60, 62 to nearly 2000, 2001 I think when she died, thereabouts, virtually 40 years. Yes, so that was another thing. And then, of course, the great moment came in '62 when Barbara suddenly announced that he would hold an East-West gathering, and directed that I should organise the group from Australia, organise their booking, and you know, and the directions were. Now I'll have to let me just check that the exact. The exact arrangement the year 1962 saw the truly significant event of these years, beloved Barbara inviting his eastern and western lovers to visit him over 7 days, 1st to 7th November 1962. This invitation was given in March, and so there was plenty of time for eager anticipation, despair because of shortage of finances, joy when this was solved, much correspondence and many cables, and the seemingly more than usual drama of moving a changing, sizable group of men, women and children from Australia to India within a strict timetable. At first it appeared certain that the family and I could not go because of lack of funds. This was also so with Robert and Lorna and their child Radha. Then a message from Barbara stated that both families had to come. And very fortunately, May Lundquist and Judith Garbutt, both as interest-free loans, and Joan Bruford as a gift, made funds available.
Yay, Mama.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah. Barbara also expressed the wish that all should return by the first available ship. But we were informed by the shipping company, P&O, that this was impossible because the ship was absolutely full. So, goaded by frequent messages from Barbara to do my utmost to effect his injunctions, I hounded, and you could say haunted, the shipping office with almost daily visits. As it was, I was working in the city, so I automatically went virtually every day to the P&O office saying, any change, anything happen? Constantly asking for cables to be sent yet again to the head office in London, asking for the 23 berths. That was the size of the group. At the 11th hour, the seeming impossible happened, and all gained bookings as wished by Barbara. When informed, he sent me a cable. Victory indeed, Barbara very happy with his dear worker. At about the same time, in reply to my saying that this visit to him will mean a great deal to Australia, Francis reported that Barbara gave a bright smile and said, yes, it will. The drama of the bookings was over, but more was to follow. But this is now, we're now getting into
The real deal.
the real deal. What happened was that 4 of us, this is apart from the 23, the four of us, and that was myself, Reg Paffel, Craig Woodford, a young chap, Anthony Thorpe. We 4 travelled by air in order to minimise the period away from work. And Barbara and the main party, 23 in all, were booked to go by ship to Colombo and then by air to Bombay, so that all could arrive in Pune in time for a special program on the 1st of October. That's the day before the 1st of November, when the East-West gathering... The 31st, yeah. Which would be the day before the East-West gathering was officially to start. This had been requested by Barbara in a cable. Barbara wishes try all disembark Colombo and take plane Bombay. This was arranged, but just as the ship was approaching Colombo, China invaded India, and all Indian airline planes were commandeered by the government. So in other words, we could say that it was now complete. We finished those 4 years, or 4.5 years. and now we've arrived at East West at the end of we've arrived the end of October, ready for the East West gathering of 1962. So, for the moment, J Barber. J Barber. Well, to continue the tale of getting and of ensuring that the whole group got to Barber in 1962. As I mentioned, the four of us, myself and three others, had flown to Bombay, and because again of our late arrival, time taken going through customs, by the time we got to the hotel where we'd booked rooms, I realised that it was so late that I should stay awake and make sure that the three of them left by the early morning train. I was concerned that the hotel staff wouldn't wake us. So it seemed to me far too casual. So I stayed awake and saw them off. And in the meantime, as I said, we had discovered that China had invaded India, and the Indian airline, all Indian airline planes were commandeered by the government. It was an emergency. All Air India flights. And I had booked the group of 23 on Air India, an Indian airline plane. So they were stranded in Colombo. And so I notified, of course I rang Erich and notified Barber, or he of course knew. And I was instructed to wait there and to see what could be done. Well, it seemed impossible. Although I did what I could going to Air India airlines, other airlines at the same time, it seemed impossible for me to do anything. And then I received word in ringing Erich in Pune. I discovered that a group, Robert had managed to get a certain number on, it turned out to be 10 of